Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about something I think is super fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
It's this interview that Joe Rogan did with JD Vance.
Oh, cool.
So you might know JD Vance from his book Hillbilly Elegy,
Right. Yeah.
but this conversation kind of reveals a whole other side of him.
I can imagine.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because it kind of catches him at this moment where he's transitioning from being an author to almost being a vice presidential nominee.
Wow. So like a pivotal point in his life.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, like overnight he kind of gets thrust into this political spotlight.
Wow. Yeah. That's got to be weird.
Yeah, it's wild. And he even talks about this moment where he like gets a call from Donald Trump and like his 7-year-old son
Uh-huh.
ends up talking to Trump about like moving into the White House.
Oh my God.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
It's just like this really personal like look into how politics and personal life can just collide.
Yeah. That's crazy to think about.
Yeah, and he also talks about like the challenges that come with that kind of public attention,
Right.
like the loss of privacy.
Like constant scrutiny.
yeah,
Still
totally.
following you around.
And he talks about having a Secret Service detail like all the time and how his family had to adjust to that.
Oh, yeah. Like what's that like for the family, you know?
Right, yeah.
You always hear about the sacrifices politicians have to make, but you never really think about what their families have to go through.
Totally. And what do you think, like, have you ever thought about those ripple effects before, like for families in the public eye?
That's a really good point. I never really considered that before.
Yeah, it's something to think about.
Yeah, definitely.
But Vance also dives into some pretty controversial topics in this interview.
Oh, like what?
So he talks a lot about what he calls radical trans ideology,
Right.
and he compares it to a belief system, and he expresses a lot of concerns about, the implications of that, particularly when it comes to children.
Right. And like the, pharmaceutical companies and all that stuff.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. So he's specifically concerned about the potential for exploitation and harm when it comes to medical interventions for young people.
Okay. So he's using the term radical trans ideology to differentiate it from people just, figuring out their own gender identity.
Exactly. Yeah, and I think it's important to like be aware of all the different perspectives on this issue.
Yeah,
But to understand his worldview, you have to understand where he's coming from.
totally. I see where you're going with that.
Yeah, and he also talks about this idea of like woke culture,
Uh-huh.
and he sees it as being fueled by those same pharmaceutical companies.
Oh, interesting.
And he talks about this like decline in public decency. He even like tells this funny story about a woman he met in Paris who was like shocked by what she saw as a shift in American culture.
Really?
Yeah, it's wild.
Wow.
And it's interesting how he weaves these like personal anecdotes into his broader commentary.
Yeah, like he's making it relatable.
Totally. And he's also really skeptical of the environmental movement.
Oh, well.
Yeah, he thinks that the focus on individual carbon footprints distracts from other pressing environmental issues.
Huh. That's an interesting take.
Yeah, he's really into nuclear power. He's not a fan of wind turbines.
I see.
And he even like throws in this comment about how vegetarian food isn't as environmentally friendly as people think.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it's a lot.
He's covering a lot of ground.
Totally. And I know you're interested in climate change. So I wonder like if his perspective challenges your own views at all.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely making me think.
Yeah, I think that's what's so great about these kinds of conversations. Okay, so brace yourself because his take on the pharmaceutical industry is where things get really intense.
Oh, boy.
He doesn't hold back. He straight up accuses companies of using Native American tribes as a shield against opioid litigation.
Wow, that's a big accusation.
Yeah, and he even claims that they like exploited loopholes to avoid facing consequences for their role in the opioid crisis.
So he sees that as a pattern.
Yeah, totally. And this distrust extends to his views on vaccines too.
That makes sense.
Yeah, he's really concerned about the lack of liability for vaccine side effects.
So he thinks that companies are basically shielded from accountability.
Exactly. And we know this is like a really complex issue with strong opinions on both sides.
Yeah, for sure.
But for Vance, this is like a part of a larger pattern of corporate influence on public health.
Right, I can see that.
Okay, so this is where things get crazy.
Okay.
He tells this story about how there was an attempted assassination of Joe Rogan during the recording.
Wait, serious?
Yeah, I'm not kidding.
No way.
Yeah.
Wow, that's scary.
Yeah, and Rogan talks about how like a shooter was firing at him from a distance and there was all this confusion.
Gosh, I can't imagine what that was like.
It's pretty intense.
Yeah,
It definitely adds a whole other layer to the conversation.
totally. I mean, it's just crazy to think that something like that could happen like during a podcast.
Right.
Like, It makes you wonder about the security risks and all that.
So-
But to shift gears a little bit, he also talks about this like lighter moment where he meets this conservative woman at the Paris Air Show,
Oh, yeah.
and she has these like interesting observations about American culture.
I love that story. It's so funny.
It is.
It's like even within a shared political ideology, there's still so much diversity of thought.
Yeah, totally.
And then he tells this hilarious story about his son lying about eating Oreo cake,
Yeah.
which like every parent can relate to.
Yeah, totally.
But he like compares his son's behavior to that of certain politicians.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, implying like a lack of accountability and honesty.
Yeah, I see that.
It's like a lighthearted moment, but it also shows his like sharp wit
Yeah.
and his ability to connect everyday life to politics.
Right.
Okay, so let's move on to some of the key policy debates that he talks about.
Okay.
So abortion is obviously a topic he feels strongly about,
Yeah.
and he makes a really passionate argument for states' rights when it comes to abortion laws.
So he thinks that voters and state legislators should have the final say.
Yeah, rather than the federal government.
Gotcha.
But he also acknowledges the complexity of the issue, like
Uh,
recognizing the need to balance autonomy with, the value of life.
It's a tough one for sure.
Yeah, and then he also talks about immigration.
Okay.
And he expresses concern about mass migration and its impact on communities.
So is he for or against it?
Well, he's critical of the catch and release policy.
Okay, yeah.
Where asylum seekers are allowed to enter the country while they're waiting for their hearings.
Right.
And he also emphasizes the need for voter ID,
Uh-huh.
which he sees as essential for election integrity.
Interesting. So I'd be curious to hear what you think as a listener.
Yeah.
Like, what are your own views on immigration policy and its impact on American society?
Yeah, that's a big question.
For sure.
And remember how we were talking about Vance's skepticism of the media?
Okay.
Well, he goes into a lot of detail about that,
Oh, we're
pointing to what he sees as blatant bias and censorship. He gives this example of like differing coverage between a comedian's joke and a presidential statement.
Oh, like to make a point about double standards.
Exactly. And he even goes so far as to say that Fox News provides more balanced coverage than NBC.
Wow, that's a bold statement.
Yeah.
Coming from him.
It's a big one.
Yeah?
And he's also highly critical of Twitter.
Yeah.
He argues that it stifles dissenting voices and engages in censorship.
So like shadow banning and stuff.
Exactly, and he even calls out specific journalistic practices at the Washington Post,
Oh, wow.
accusing them of prioritizing narratives over objective reporting, so
Mhm.
he's not holding back.
No, it's not.
And then he talks about Kamala Harris,
Okay.
and he expresses concern about what he sees as her lack of policy knowledge.
Uh-huh.
And he even questions her ability to handle the presidency.
Interesting.
And he also brings up the media's handling of the domestic abuse allegations against her,
Right.
suggesting there was a double standard in coverage compared to Trump.
Hmm.
It's like he's saying, look, they're quick to condemn some figures while giving others a pass.
Right.
And this skepticism extends to philanthropy, too,
Oh, really?
which kind of surprised me.
Yeah, that's not something you hear every day.
He actually suggests that philanthropy can have a dark side.
Like, what do you mean?
Well, he uses the example of experimentation on underprivileged communities.
Oh, wow.
And he highlights the potential for exploitation even when intentions are good.
I see.
It's like he's saying we need to be more critical of where those dollars are going.
Yeah. And who's benefiting?
Exactly.
That's a good point.
And then there's this part where he talks about psychedelics.
Oh, did he really?
Yeah, I know it's not something you'd expect from him.
No, not at all.
But he specifically talks about the potential for psychedelics like psilocybin to help veterans with PTSD.
Wow.
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
It shows a willingness to consider unconventional solutions
Totally.
and challenge traditional thinking.
Yeah. I mean, it's not a topic you typically hear discussed in mainstream politics,
No, not at all.
especially from someone like him.
Right.
It's a really fascinating glimpse into that side of him.
I'm just amazed by how much ground this conversation covers.
Me too.
We went from parenting anecdotes to attempted assassinations to psychedelics.
It's a lot. Yeah.
It's wild, but it all kind of connects back to this theme of challenging the status quo.
Totally. Like, he's skeptical of institutions. He's
Yeah.
critical of the media.
Right.
He's willing to consider unconventional solutions.
And it's almost like this through line from Hillbilly Elegy to potentially being VP.
Yeah.
It's like he's saying, hey, the old ways aren't working. We need new ideas.
Yeah. And he's not afraid to say it.
Exactly. And speaking of new ideas, he also talks about the Iraq War.
Ah.
He calls it an unforced catastrophe.
Wow. So he doesn't mince words.
Nope.
Yeah.
And I think that resonates with a lot of people these days.
Yeah, I mean, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum,
Sure.
it's like a growing sentiment that maybe America's interventions haven't always worked out the way they were supposed to.
Right. And what do you think about that as a listener? Like, do you agree with his assessment of the Iraq War?
Yeah, it's something to ponder for
It's
sure.
a heavy question.
Yeah,
But
definitely
it
that.
leads into his concluding remarks, where he calls for like a new American consensus.
Oh, interesting.
Like he's not just critiquing the system, he's actually trying to imagine a better way forward.
I like that.
Yeah, he talks about like moving beyond the failures of the past and embracing a more realistic vision for the future.
What does that even look like?
Well, he talks about reassessing our priorities,
Okay.
adopting a more humble approach to global leadership
Right.
and really refocusing on the challenges facing everyday Americans.
So bringing it back home.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what does this all mean for you as a listener?
Well, I think the big takeaway is that politics is messy
Yeah,
and it's always changing.
for sure.
And it's up to each of us to engage with different perspectives,
Right.
to question our assumptions,
Absolutely.
and to like form our own conclusions.
And we've only scratched the surface here.
Yeah, we have.
So if you're interested in learning more, we highly encourage you to check out the full interview.
It's really thought-provoking.
Yeah, it might challenge your beliefs
Oh, yeah.
and leave you with more questions than answers.
And that's a good thing.
It is.
Keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
Absolutely.
Until next time.